So welcome everyone to AGM for 2025 for the Global Campaign on Military Spending. I'm Russell Whiting, I'm the Network Coordinator at GCOMS UK. In the room we've got various members of the steering committee who have been working with us through the past year, and I'll say a bit more about that when we reach the business section of our AGM.
Thank you,
But to start off with, I'm delighted that we're joined by Professor Ron Smith from Birkbeck, University of London. Ron is a very experienced defence economist and author of many interesting articles and other pieces of work in this field. So Ron has a presentation for us, and then he's going to ask he's not going to ask questions, he's going to answer your questions. He might ask some questions, we'll have to wait and see. So Ron, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. I'm not used to Zoom, we normally use Teams. I want to check whether people can see the slides.
Yes, great.
Okay. Just a little bit of background. I got involved in defence economics back in the early 1970s when a group of us were going to do alternative economic strategy, and we produced a pamphlet on it. I was the most junior, so I got to do the numbers. And one of the things, of course, we were going to do was cut military spending. And there wasn't a lot of literature on the effects of that. So I started looking at that and have been doing it ever since. And part of the reason is there's very few defence economists, so that I'm usually employed. One thing I think we do is we've got a new supporter. President Trump on Friday said, let's check the military. We're going to find billions, hundreds of billions of fraud and abuse there. And so that you may not welcome him, but he is on your side effectively. And I'll talk about some other strange allies you might have. What I'm going to do a little bit is talk about the historical context, the current environment, the background to the Strategic Defence Review, and then some prospects. Let me know if there's any problems with, I hope you can see the slides. Okay, there's a long-term historical context, which is the share of military expenditure in GDP from 1700. And I've chopped it off at 20% because in World War I and World War II, it would have goes up to almost 50%. Almost half of the output being devoted to the military. In the 18th century, you see all these peaks, which are all the wars, Spanish succession, Austrian succession, Jenkins era, and the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The Victorian period was a period of low spending, Crimea, Boer War. Then there was a peak for the Korean War, and it's come down. Military spending is about long-term average now, around 2% of GDP. And how did we finance that? With national debt. You could see this jumping up of the national debt during the wars. It declined in 1913, jumped up again, declined, and in the period from around 2000, the increase in debt has been largely non-military, which is kind of unusual. So currently there's a debt crisis. This is just from the OBR, the share of taxes. Taxes are going up and they're going higher than was predicted in the past. Similarly, expenditure spending, there was a peak during COVID. It's high by historical standards and it's higher than was previously predicted. So the government has a real fiscal policy problem and a new set of rules, a new measure of debt, and the public sector net financial liability should be falling as a share of GDP. fiscal rules typically are promising to be good in the future. You always postpone having to have the hard. We have this position at the moment where interest rates have gone up substantially for the government. So financing the public debt is a major problem. And simultaneously, we have a substantially worse geopolitical context. People talked about the rules-based international order, and that's threatened both in the strategic sphere and in the economic sphere. The whole role of the US is up for question. It was up for question before Trump was elected, but even more so. Growing insecurity and perceptions of threat, because there's just conflicts in a very wide variety. The well-known ones in Ukraine, Middle East, then Sudan, Congo, Somalia, Yemen. So there's a range of issues. And so what you're getting is this interaction between increasing threats and the resource constraints which come from the delicate fiscal position. And this produces strained relationships between the defense and finance ministries, not just between the Ministry of Defense and His Majesty's Treasury in the UK, but much more generally. So as one hand, there's this pressure for increased military spending. On the other hand, there are these tight financial constraints. The antagonism, my experience in the Ministry of Defense is enemy number one has always been the Treasury. The people we're fighting come way down the list relative to the battles with the Treasury. And during the Cold War, there was a bunker under the Cotswolds where the top people were going to be hidden in the event of a nuclear attack. The MOD was in charge of it, and it didn't include anybody from the Treasury among the people who are going to be saved. Currently, there's going to be the Strategic Defence Review on the election. They commissioned this. It's being done slightly unusually by an outside panel. Lord Robertson, who was previously Secretary General of NATO, Sir Richard Barrons, and Fiona Hill, who's British from the tying, but has been a national security advisor to Donald Trump. She's a Russian expert. Team from Ministry of Defense working closely with the Treasury, and the Treasury's in the support. Government said it will set out a path to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence. Currently, it's just over 2%. But that's going to be dealt with at some future fiscal event. So the people on the Strategic Defence Review have got to make choices about what to buy without knowing how much the Treasury is going to let it spend. And again, your unusual allies, probably the most sincere pacifists are the people in the Treasury. They just hate spending the money, and they're very well aware of how the Ministry of Defence can waste the money. So in the Strategic Defence Review, they set up what they call parameters. Firstly, total commitment to the independent nuclear deterrent, enhancing UK's contribution to the alliance, protecting our citizens. That actually is a difficult one at the moment because we essentially have no air and missile defense. So there's no real, if anybody did want to attack us, there's essentially no support. Support for Ukraine, making sure that defense personnel are looked out after, and that's an issue. They're losing defense personnel very rapidly. Recruitment's a major problem, particularly with the army. Maintain the UK's defence ties to the Indo-Pacific region, the Gulf and the Middle East. And within these parameters, it will consider the need for prioritisation. And within these parameters, defence is just not affordable. They just can't do this. And it indicates a complete lack of realism by saying before they start, they're going to do all these different things. And so the questions are, what are the UK role in the world and its vital interests? What are the likely threats to those interests? How much can we rely on our allies? It's absolutely crucial. What are the most effective military responses to those threats? How much can we afford? And at the moment, there's this gap of 17 billion black hole in the equipment budget, which is a real issue. And the answer to all those questions is we've no idea at all. Almost every previous defence review is overtaken by unpredicted events. The Knott review in 1980 was going to scrap a large part of the Navy, which then had to be used in the Falklands. Options for Change in 1990 was followed by the Gulf War. The Strategic Defence Review of 97-8 was followed by Afghanistan and Iraq. The Integrated Review that Boris Johnson said was just followed COVID and Ukraine. So defence reviews are usually prompted by economic crises. As at the moment, they chart a way forward that's rapidly reversed. And in every review since Healy's review of the 1960s, it's been planned to withdraw from east of Suez, but we're still east of Suez. And one of the parameters was staying east of Suez, where we have bases and our aircraft carriers. Now, last August, I did a presentation on the defence budget at the Ministry of Defence, and I started off with a yes minister type of thing. Hacker asked Sir Humphrey, well, Sir Humphrey, exactly how much do we spend on defence? And Sir Humphrey responds, well, Prime Minister, do you want the NATO definition, what we report to them? Do we want to report the National Accounts definition, Committee on the Functions of Government, COFOG definition? There's a thing called the net cash requirement, but cash is so 20th century, it doesn't really get in. Then we have the defence budget on the resource accounting and budgeting system, and that has a whole range of problems. So annual managed expenditure is largely provisions, and that's provisions for all those old nuclear submarines tied up in docks in various places. And there's a strange effect. If the Treasury changes the discount rate, that becomes a lot cheaper if it raises it. So the annual managed expenditure went from plus 11 billion to minus 14 billion 2 years ago because of the change in the discount rate. But you can think of a number around 60 billion, something like that. And that's the sort of, but it's split down in various ways. And just under $1 billion is going to Ukraine. National Audit Office looked at the equipment plan, which is a 10-year plan, and just said, it's just unaffordable. Forecast costs exceed the available budget by 17 billion. And this is this black hole, and this is a real black hole, in the sense black holes suck money into them. And the aircraft carrier, the nuclear programs, the F-35s just suck things away from the whole structure. And costs to support the nuclear deterrent have exceeded budget by about 8 billion. Nuclear deterrent is lots of different bits. It's the submarines, the electronics which go into it, the warheads, the missiles, the nuclear reactors that drive it, and all of those are running over cost. The nuclear is ring-fenced, and it's around 118 billion over 10 years. But these are rough order of magnitudes. TLBs are top-level budgets, and they're the ones who estimate what the costs are going to be, and they don't do it consistently. So they have different rules about what they include and what they don't include, and that makes comparison difficult. Defence budget as a whole, 10-year deficit was 40-odd billion, and there are, even if they wanted to increase it, probably isn't the supply in terms of doing that. And there are real problems. The House of Commons Defence Committee produced a report called Obsolescent and Outgunned, the British Army's armoured vehicle capability. quote, "This report reveals a woeful story of bureaucratic procrastination, military indecision, financial mismanagement, and general ineptitude." And it gets even more scathing later on. And there's a whole range of problems with the armoured vehicles. My general conclusion, and I'm happy to answer questions on more detailed bit, is these useless big projects, they're nuclear, the aircraft carriers, the F-35s, eat up the budget and leave very little useful for the small items. There's a major problem with body armour. And that's because they economize on those little things because the big programs have a whole round. There's a vast amount that's wasted on procurement. It's late, over budget, and fails to meet requirements. There may well be a big change. A whole load of the tech bros are coming in to challenge the primes. SpaceX must built that for what NASA estimates a 1/10 of what it would cost. And the old primes like Boeing, who have lost a whole set of their skills, are losing out to firms Palantir you may have heard of, Anduril Industries, which is a drone, Swarm Aero, another drone. These are used to cheap production and rapid innovation, neither of which are characteristic of the old primes. In the UK, my feeling is most people are not really interested in defence, and there's not a strong political momentum for change, either for increases or decreases. The final comment, as always, the disarmer's best friend may be His Majesty's Treasury, who definitely want to cut military spending just because of all the other fiscal problems that they're facing. As I say, I'm